24th of February, we began the special military operation in Ukraine to protect our citizens in Donbass and to ensure security of our homeland, Russian soldiers.
As of 24th of February 2022, started the war between Ukraine and Russia. The justifications Vladimir Putin gave to us do not seem any plausible. So what really happened? Follow me on this complex journey of Ukraine and Russia. It started way back in 9th century. A group of northern traders started settling in Kiev, the present-day capital of Ukraine. The people who were settling in Kiev were known as the Rus, meaning the men who row. In the year 1223, 31st of May, the Rus society fell as a war between the Rus and the Mongol people saw rise, and eventually the Mongol people won. Soon, year 1237 saw the rise of Grand Duchy of Moscow. At first, Grand Duchy of Moscow only controlled sub-Ukraine parts, but that would change eventually as the control went back and forth with them and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth for the Ukraine mainland. Crimea, a peninsula under control of the Ottoman Empire. They gained independence for a brief period in 1783. This would soon change as Catherine the Great would order Russia to annex Crimea. In the 18th century, Ukraine started gaining importance than ever before. At the same time were the Belarusians. Russians saw this and called them ethnically Russians. In 1804, the growing separatist movement caused the ban of Ukrainian language being taught in schools and encouraged the teaching of the Russian language. 1853 to 1856, the Crimean War started among the Ottoman Empire, France, and Italy. War was everywhere until the siege of the Sevastopol. France won the war in 30th of March 1856. The Treaty of France signed the treaty to make sure that any reminiscence of any Russians, Ukrainians, or Belarusians to be completely removed. Later, in 1917, Ukraine, including other former USSR countries like Poland and Georgia, were independent for a really long time until in 1922, the USSR was formed to unify all the Rus people and went on to be one of the fiercest forces in world politics. Almost 2 decades later, in 1943, the Nazi Germany took over Ukraine, and an estimate of 4 million people had to migrate east towards Moscow. Just a year later, in 1944, the Nazi Germany were evicted, and at the war's end, 5 to 6 million lives were cost, and a famine conducted in 1946 to 1947 cost 2 more million lives. Few years later, in 1953, the Crimean Peninsula was back in control of Russia. This Crimea Peninsula was later given to Ukraine as a sign of peacekeeping. A few decades later, in 1991, the USSR community came to an end, and all the former provinces of this region were independent. And the government of Ukraine asked the public a question. The question was, do you support the declaration of independence of Ukraine? The final voting concluded to be 92% yes and 8% no. The vote for the first president happened, and Leonid Kravchuk got elected. Also, after the collapse of USSR, Ukraine became the third largest holder of nuclear power plants and weapons. but the computers controlling them ended up being in Russia after the split. Well later, in 2004, the Orange Revolution took place in Kiev, in which the protest was for a replacement of a corrupt president. Viktor Yanukovych was elected instead, and the Ukrainians would soon find out that he is also corrupt. 10 years later, in 2014, another protest took place. It was known as the Maidan Revolution. The protest happened as the refusal to sign a document by NATO. If they did sign this document, they could have been a member of NATO and avoid all the constant threats by Russia. When it actually came time to deal with NATO, Viktor Yanukovych chose to deal with Russia. In that deal offered by Russia, Russia promised Ukraine that they will never attack them. At the very same time, it was suspected of Russia sponsoring the eastern region of Ukraine, known as the Donbas region. 8 years later, after all this time, 24th of February 2022, Ukraine is now on full warfare. Russia has denied of Ukraine as a sovereign country, but the justifications given by Vladimir Putin are just too weak for most people. But from my research, I have found the real reason why Vladimir Putin has decided to do a full-scale invasion on Ukraine is NATO's expansion. Since 2014, Russia's hand puppet, that is Viktor Yanukovych, has moved away from his seat and newer presidents have been ruling Ukraine. And if the newer presidents rule any further, there is a chance that these newer presidents might drive Ukraine into signing up for NATO. This is a major issue for Russia, as if a country joins NATO, they will be a part of Ukraine. If they are close to Europe, of course, they will be a part of Europe, and the relation between Europe and Russia have never been so good. If Ukraine does join NATO, that puts Russia one step closer to their spiritual enemy, and they seriously don't want that. And Putin does not admit this. He says that this is all for peacekeeping. Of taking over things. Take over that red subscribe button and make it grey. Anyways, that's it for today's video. If you liked it, make sure to hit that like button and don't forget to share this video if you want anyone else knowing this. And anyways, it's Mahadevan signing out.